Students of Reddit, what was the reason for why one of your teachers had a breakdown during class? My 8th grade Spanish teacher and the freshman baseball coach were having an affair. It eventually became public knowledge, and she had several breakdowns as her divorce played out over the course of my 8th grade year. I had the pleasure of joining the freshman baseball team the next year and experiencing his own share of breakdowns from his own divorce. Story 2. Physics teacher came into class late, walked past the podium and walked into the chalkboard. Like, he would have kept walking if it wasn't there. He then picked up one of those plastic pen things that you put chalk in, proceeded to try and write on the chalkboard even though the pen was empty of chalk, all the while mumbling incoherently. Found out later he had a stroke and managed to drive himself to the university. Edit. He didn't return to teaching that year, and as best as I recall, he ended up retiring due to health complications. He was in his 60s, and along with the stroke, he had fallen and hit his head. Online searching shows he passed away about 8 years later. I don't think this is the kind of breakdown that the question was asking. This one's kind of sad, man. I wasn't ready for this. That super sucks, but also impressive that he drove himself to the university mid-stroke. The brain works in mysterious ways. Story 3. I feel legitimately bad about causing this one. Junior year of high school. My lit teacher was from Wisconsin and had a very thick Midwestern accent. This was in the South, so a number of her intonations were very noticeable. In particular, words with an AG syllable stuck out. For example, bag would be pronounced with a mixture of like bay and egg. She was reading a passage from Beowulf to the class one day, and to paraphrase the modern English translation, came across the following sentence. Beowulf slayed the dragon with the dagger. It was too many Midwestern syllables too close together for my friend and I to tactfully handle in our 16-year-old mindsets, and involuntarily we laughed. Upon attempting to cover it up, it probably sounded more like a snicker, and she didn't take it too well. I wish I could say that she scolded us, but it was so much worse than that. She shut the book, looked at the floor, and straight up cried for what must have been 45 seconds, but it felt like 45 minutes. Dejected, breathless sobs. Once she had recovered from this, she picked it back up where she left off like it hadn't happened. Even though, generally speaking, I really disliked the teacher, it sucked, knowing that our immature reaction caused her to feel ridiculed. We didn't have malicious intent, but the result was the same, and we of course apologized to her privately after the fact. Shout out to OP for seemingly being pretty emotionally mature even at 16. To be able to realize that that was a crappy thing to do and apologize for it even if they didn't like the teacher. That's really huge. I do think that accent is one of those things that just kind of snickering or mocking someone for is really bad, though. I've always been a strong believer that the things that you can comment on or make jokes about and have people not take it so harshly are things that they can, change perhaps. Although that rule mostly applies for compliments and stuff like that, or criticisms. In my mind, it's the same thing. You never make fun of someone's laugh, right? Because that is one of the most involuntary sounds a person can make. A true laugh, it happens. They don't control how it sounds. And to make fun of that is just being like, I don't like this part of you that you cannot change. And an accent is very similar in my mind. Sure, you can change it with a lot of work, but anyway, I'm talking too much about this. Basically, OP, you did good apologizing and realizing that what you did was kind of crappy. Story 4. We made our English teacher cry. But we didn't want to because we really liked her. She was about to switch to another school and she had some really important things to do. She needed to call someone, so she gave us a task to do and left the room for 5 minutes. We were a horrible class. Around 16, 17 at this time, and mainly boys. We had breakfast together that day and stuff was still in the classroom. So the boys decided it was time to throw it around and hit the window with a stick of butter. While one boy tried to clean the window using a squeegee, is that the right word? Never used it before and I'm not native. Someone else decided to throw out the trash. Another teacher came because she saw the trash flying by the window of her classroom, and in the moment she started yelling at us, the other teacher came back. She immediately started crying as she saw what was going on. I think she was angry and overwhelmed because she liked the school and didn't want to leave. But in this moment, we were little jerks making the decision easier. But the next week, she came into the class and had written a small poem for us about being too old to throw around trash and playing with butter. That little poem is hilarious and very cute. And the fact that the students, they, from what I understand from the story, cleaned up the window without being told to. They knew what they were doing was stupid and they should clean up after themselves. So, hey, some respect for that too. It does just sound like you guys were being little craps and the teacher was having a rough time. Bad combo. Unfortunate. Story 5. A few years ago, I took a class in design theory. It was the pet project of the head of the college and taught the design principles behind everything from common household objects to room layouts to entire organizations. It was an absolutely brutal class. but uniquely informative. One day towards the end of the semester, we went over the use of humor in design. The professor spent the entire class talking about how laughter and amusement can be used to engage an audience and change how people see a situation. The whole time he was laughing, cracking jokes, and good ones too, and generally making sure the class had a good time. And at the end of the lesson, he told us to not underestimate the power of laughter. After all, it was how he had gotten through the lecture that day. His father had died a couple of days prior. He broke down crying after he told us. It's probably the most impactful lecture I've ever attended. Oh, I know I'm coming in a lot here, but what a way to drive home your point, seemingly by accident. But if that didn't cement the learning of why laughter is important, then I don't know what will. Oh my god. Story 6. Couple of students were arguing across the classroom. One of them thought he'd be clever and tell the other to go and hang yourself. Teacher ran out of the room crying. Came back in 5 minutes later screaming at him that her dad had hung himself, called him a horrible boy, etc. She quit, like, that week. Everyone kind of ganged up on him after class. Perhaps a bit far, but I think somewhat deserved. Edit. To clarify, he didn't get beaten up. He got surrounded by a group of guys his age, mostly friends of his, and got verbally berated for being a little crap and upsetting the teacher. He took a punch to the arm or two, maybe a kick to the calf, but nothing serious. It was unmistakably the moment that his peers told him that he was out of line. Nobody attacked him. Story 7. Grade 10 science class. We were taking turns using some kind of lung capacity measuring device. Breathe into a tube and a small plastic ball gets raised by the force of your breath and something gets measured somehow. I can't really remember details aside from the plastic ball. Anyway, the teacher takes his turn, apparently trying to show off with how hard he can breathe out. Somehow breaks the measuring device. The teacher goes into a rage after realizing he broke it, briefly tries to fix it, gives up, picks up a metal garbage can and throws it in anger. He storms out of the room and doesn't come back for 10 to 15 minutes, at which point he returns and acts like nothing happened. It was more bizarre and amusing than anything else. Story 8. We'll call him Mr. Jiggles. Of course, that's not his real name. It's not anyone's real name, but it's fitting enough, as he was a rather large fella. A nice man, all the same, just rotund. Now, I heard he was on PCP, I heard he was infected by devils, I heard all manners of rumors. But from the mouth of Mr. Jiggles, none of that was true. See, one day in the middle of class, he just stopped giving a lecture, and somehow became stricken with the idea that he was Jesus. I'm not making this up. It does sound like BS even writing this, but I assure you it happened. 1998 was the year, to be exact. He left the classroom and stood up in the hallway waiting for class change and then picked students to bless. He'd walk up, bless a student, and then walk away, all the while preaching loudly that he was the coming of Christ. Now, I'm not sure if it was a second coming in his mind, or who knows, maybe it was the first. That was unclear, but one of the students wasn't receptive to his blessing and swatted at Mr. Jiggles' hand. Mistake. Mr. Jiggles grabbed him by the throat and dragged him down the hallway, promising to personally carry him into hell. He actually just carried him into a biology teacher's classroom. She tried to talk him down, but it wasn't working. The police and EMS arrived quickly enough and no one was hurt. Now, I think everyone assumed Mr. Jiggles was fired, but the next year, he was back. Everyone had a version of the story and a theory for why it happened. Some say his wife was cheating on him. Others said it was some drug-induced psychosis. But one day at lunch, we were talking about something unrelated, and I just asked him point blank, what happened? The answer? Well, he was on some kind of psych meds, had run out, and forgot to refill them before hitting empty. His pharmacy was out of that particular medicine. Told him it would be 5 days before they got it in. He thought he'd be fine for those 5 days. He was, mistaken. Hey, shout out to him for just straight up addressing what happened. It was probably a bit embarrassing for him, but he just was like, yeah, this is what happened. I made an oopsie. Respect to you, Mr. Jiggles. That being said, I will do without one of your blessings, thank you. Story 9. The one that sticks out is my history teacher, who was a level 10 incompetent at anything. She usually blathered on through class about stupid things. She was always very well put together, dressed well, hair done. It's just there was no substance to her teaching or conversational topics. One day she started talking about a coworker she was very close to when she was young. Mind you, she had to be approaching her 60s. The story started out innocent enough, and we were all basically ignoring her. And it pretty soon veered off into this terrible reality. Her coworker had gone home from work and died in a car accident on the way home. This had to have been 30 years ago. She was crying, saying how much she missed her and how crazy life can be. The way she explained the story was so sad, too. They had made plans the following day, and my teacher was excitedly waiting for that coworker to come in. I disliked that teacher immensely, but I felt so sorry for her. She stood there crying because her friend was gone. I don't think at 15 I could imagine that sort of loneliness or pain. But now, a good 15 years later, I've had some experiences, and I sympathize with her. Story 10. This one cool guy, let's call him Davy, tormented our English teacher for no reason. She was very sweet and passionate about her job, but this guy was a jerk. He would write things on the board before class really small in random spots like witch, pig, and other random insults. The one day that caused the breakdown was when he stole the remote for the wall-mounted TV. Her class was the time period that had the daily announcements, so the TV was heavily used. So she searched for the remote and couldn't find it, and had to stand on her tiptoes to control the TV from the button on the front. A little bit through the announcements, the TV turns off. Everyone's reaction was weird, so teacher got back up to turn it on again. A minute or so later, it went off again. Of course, at that point, it starts getting suspicious. She jokes, "Okay, is someone playing a prank on me?" And no one says anything because no one knew Davy had the remote. He repeats turning it off 2 more times directly after she turned it back on, and she snapped. "Okay, who has the remote? Who is doing this?" And being immature 9th graders, we all start snickering because it was funny. After no one fessed up, she starts unloading about how she's been having a tough time lately, and starts spewing out all this information about her personal life, just ranting away. And during the middle of her rant, Davy turns the TV on and starts flipping through the channels. The teacher lets out an animalistic yell and bursts into tears. Cue the entire class with shocked Pikachu faces. She throws the classroom door open and runs out. She was gone for like 20 minutes and returns with the JROTC teacher, literal hard as steel drill sergeant. He was calmly talking to us how what we were doing as a class was crappy to her, and the perp needs to step forward, and Davy had the balls to turn the TV off and on. Dead silence. You could have heard dust falling on the ground, and everyone was like, "Okay, we're dead." At this point, someone who knew he took it quietly pointed at Davy. The drill instructor goes over to him, pulls him up out of his desk by his shirt collar, and screams in his face, "Do you have the freaking remote?" Feet dangling off the ground, his whole arm was shaking as he took the remote out of his pocket and showed it. He was toast now. He was swiftly removed from the class by the drill instructor and teacher, while we all sat there for the rest of class doing nothing until the bell rang. And hopefully that day Davy learned an important lesson about when a joke goes too far. It was funny for a bit, Davy. You had the whole class laughing, and then you pressed it a little too much. It's an important line to learn, for sure. Story 11, September 11th, 2003. We were in first period, and we had a moment of silence and remembrance at the time the first plane hit the tower. I think it was a Channel 1 thing. The teacher broke down. She was panting, pulling her hair, and began mumbling to herself. The mumbling became louder, and she started to pace. Finally, she walked over to a coffee pot that was in the room and picked up a large Ziploc bag of ground coffee while screaming that she wished it was Coke. She then fell against the wall and slid down. We let her go on for a minute or two before a few of my friends and I went over and helped her up and walked her to the front office. We got the best long-term sub ever after that. A true influence I'd only seen a few times in all of my schooling. I hope this teacher got the help they needed, because, oh boy, something was not good in that brain. I don't know what it was, but this affected her greatly for some reason. And whatever it was, I hope a good therapist or good meds, whichever was needed, was administered. Given? I don't know. Story 12. During my freshman year, the culinary teacher went on leave while she had a baby. We made a pact to not talk at all for the whole time we were there. We had a little radio that we played music on while we worked, and we only played Country Roads. This was before it was a meme. After a few weeks of this, we all got pretty tired of it, but decided to stick it out. One day, the sub was explaining the recipe for us, and she just started begging us to say something. We all just kind of looked at each other as she started crying, and none of us knew what to do. She walked out and didn't come back. We all felt super bad, and I still do. Story 13. I was a TA in high school and heard more teacher gossip than most, but I kept it to myself. Short version, a teacher was pregnant by her husband who had died of a heart attack during the conception. Obviously, this messed with her quite a bit, and no teacher brought it up, nor did I. Somehow, some jerk in her class found out, and when I was TAing in the room next door and heard her sobbing in the hall, I signaled Mr. H that I would check it out. It was her, Mrs. V, and she was a goddamned wreck, and all I could do was hug her while she babbled out something about a Chad in her room that had said she had gotten knocked up somewhere else and murdered her husband to cover it up. What the hell? I went into the next room and proceeded to berate this freshman before sending him to the office, calling the principal before he got there. As a TA, I really didn't have much pull, but I was so freaking furious that our crappy principal actually listened. The Chad was suspended for 10 days and moved to another class, with the warning that one more word about Mrs. V would cement an expulsion. I had another student continue the lesson. In fact, they were shell-shocked enough to stay quiet while I went back out and let a teacher cry on a 17-year-old girl until help arrived by way of every female teacher that could come and help her. She went on leave after that for, I think, a couple of months. Lots of therapy, according to the teachers that knew I didn't spread their gossip. Thankfully, she returned, and later on gave birth to a healthy boy whom she named after her husband. The Chad? Oh, expelled before she even got back. Mr. H, my teacher, overheard him running his mouth the first day he was back. Screw that frickin' jerk into the bowels of hell for what he did to Mrs. V. And yes, when she returned, she thanked me with some embarrassment and presented me with McDonald's for lunch. I'm so glad she came back. Amazing teacher. Story 14. Mrs. Bradshaw, who was a terrible teacher and should have been forced to retire before the Truman administration came into class and put on an impromptu one-woman play about why students should donate to the United Way charity fund that was running. This included, but wasn't limited to, her throwing a shawl over her head and putting on a really racist accent to be a foreign child getting their first set of crayons. We all laughed and snickered at her, and she threw a fit that lasted the whole class period. A few weeks later, she said something to me and I talked back, I don't remember what, and she turned around and fastballed a ruler at my face. I ducked out of the way and the kid behind me took it in the eye. He was wearing glasses though. High school earth and space science teacher lost her cool completely, taking a week off after someone called her olive oil to her face. She looked exactly like her. Narrator coming in here for a second just to say olive oil is spelt olive and then O-Y-L as the last name. I don't know who this is or who this references though. Alright, back to the last part of story 14. Shop class teacher had a really bad Vietnam flashback and ended up flipping over his desk. Turned out a student put an acid tab in the guy's coffee during first or second period and it kicked in around third or fourth. The student was never caught out and the teacher took the rest of the year off. Too bad too. Really nice guy. Story 15. In high school, 9th grade history teacher. We just didn't listen to him. We were downright disrespectful, and looking back, I feel guilty for being such a craphead. We'd all get to class late and speak over him trying to teach the lesson. Sometimes we listened because tests eventually come back around and some of us want to pass, but most of the time we were total jerks, until one day he erupted. After that, we never saw him again and we got a new teacher. We treated him with the utmost respect. New teacher, about 2 years after graduation, went to jail after someone set him up on Craigslist, Chris Hansen style. And once in middle school, my class made the dance teacher cry because we refused to pay attention that day. Usually we were good, a little loud, but good. I don't know, but this day we were particularly rowdy. She just broke down into tears because she didn't understand why we wouldn't listen and started crying about why we didn't like her and how she tried so hard to make us listen. We straightened up after that because she was really sweet with us all the time and really believed in us. Story 16. My really crappy teacher in year 6, I live in England, got mad at me. On my birthday too. All because I didn't move places within 3 seconds after telling me to, and she shouted at me. The pure shock of the incident made me fall off my chair and the whole room went silent. I wasn't that hurt, but my God, was I mad. As I was lifting my chair back up, I don't know what got into me, but I gave her the middle finger. She began screaming at me again, but I just ignored her and did all the work before anyone else could. She went back to her desk and just sulked for the rest of the day. But once she went to the bathroom after lunch because our class was in the main hall where we had lunch and assemblies, we had to clean up. It was a low-budget school. I was lifting one of the tables with my friend and I noticed something on her computer. One of the minimized tabs of Photoshop had a small bit poking out, and being the curious 11-year-old I was, I opened it and saw a class photo with me cut out of it. Whilst it wasn't the most extreme breakdown, it was pretty messed up. Story 17. Okay, so I was in 7th grade and we had the nicest science teacher. One day, this kid with no soul decided he had enough of her bad teaching and called her out on it, including a few middle grade insults such as the classic R-slur, lonely, and straight up boring. Long story short, she ended up crying and another teacher had to come in until she calmed down. After 20 minutes, she came back like nothing happened and the kid was moved from her class. What a jerk. Story 18. My social studies teacher back in middle school. He was new, taking over for another teacher who mysteriously retired halfway through the year. The kids just went nuts with acting out for whatever reason. And during one class, everyone was being so unruly that he looked like he was going to snap. He had no control. He left for a minute to cool down and came back to find that a bunch of idiots were now sitting upside down in the chairs. And snap, He did. The worst part, in rage, he tried throwing something as hard as he could at the wall. Unfortunately, all he had in his hand was currently a tissue. Despite all the force of his crazed pitch, the tissue just kind of fluttered for about a foot. I will never forget the look of impotent rage that swallowed up his face. I think that was when he left the room. Of course, he stuck it out and became one of the best and most influential teachers of my life, so it all turned out okay. I'm just imagining being mad beyond belief, having only a tissue in my hand, throwing it. Oh, that would make me lose my mind. I get it. I would be so mad after that. Only being able to throw a tissue and it goes nowhere. Oh man. I sympathize with this teacher for sure. Story 19. Went to an all-girls private school, and the biggest jerk scratched her laptop and wanted a new one. So, she threw her current one down a set of stairs during class. My classroom had the door open and the teacher was the best, but very stern. She got to the hallway to check out the commotion and lost her absolute mind on this girl who, for the record, needed it. Another teacher heard the yelling, came over, and my teacher came back into class to a room full of terrified and confused students, because we had all remained in our seats. Carried on class like normal after that. Story 20. My senior year of high school, I took an AP psychology class. Was one of the best teachers in the school. This teacher had been there for like ever and everyone liked her. Never thought that she would retire. Her whole classroom was covered in ducks. Like rubber ducks, duck decals, holiday ducks, light up ducks, and more ducks. I had her for the last period of the day, so we always had some laughs. We found out about halfway through the year that she was in fact going to retire. During the last week of school, she showed us a video that explained the ducks and why they were important to her. Now, she has watched this video a million times, but this time was different. We were the last class to watch it with her, and at the end, she just sat there for a second and started crying. She loved teaching, and she loved teaching psych especially. She loved the connections that she made with her students, and it all just hit her in that last class. This was the end of her teaching career. She wiped away the tears and gave us all little graduation ducks that had caps and gowns on, and she told us that we could all choose our favorite duck from around the room and take it with us. I still have my purple duck from her, and it goes everywhere with me. My grad duck is always in my backpack. She really made an impact on all of her students, and we will all be her ducklings forever. If I sounded like I choked up during that, I did. That's so sweet. Oh, I love teachers like this. Good teachers just put their hearts and souls into teaching, and it's incredible, and they care so much, and it just makes me so happy to think about the ducks. Oh, it's so sweet that she gave them to the people in the class, dude. All right, I could gush about this one forever, so we gotta move on or I never will. Story 21. One of my biology teachers. Her daughter had just delivered a mutated stillborn. Because the universe is crappy sometimes, it happened to be during the unit where we covered reproduction and genetic mutations. She was in the middle of explaining a chromosomal abnormality when she looked down at the floor and started bawling. After graduating, I heard her son was lost in a fire while he was at college. While visiting some old teachers, I stopped by her classroom. She always had the most confident, slightly loud demeanor, but had become demure and fairly quiet. She also stopped dyeing her hair black and let it go completely gray. She looked broken. After speaking with a friend's sibling, he said something like, "Yeah, in the middle of a lesson, she'll sometimes go to her office and shut the door." He also said she had become a total pushover. She used to notoriously be a hard teacher. In the good way, though. It was like a sustained breakdown until she finally retired early. A friend of mine who'd received an F in her class said, "What goes around comes around." I stopped speaking to him. Story 22. In 7th to 9th grade, my class had this one student who was the most unruly little jerk you could possibly imagine. She had this one friend who tried to impress her by being just like her. The former one particularly enjoyed screwing with our physics teacher, and of course her friend followed suit. Our teacher's classroom breakdowns because of them was a weekly occurrence. As he was trying to teach, they kept talking loudly with each other, on the phone and generally just being disruptive to the class. Our teacher told them to stop multiple times and they generally kept refusing. Not always. Sometimes their parents were contacted and they got better for a while, but they inevitably returned to their disruptive behavior. I remember this one time during class when our teacher finally asked them to leave the classroom entirely, with several of their fellow students, including myself, agreeing with him and telling them to leave. But of course they kept refusing to do anything they were told. I remember looking into our teacher's eyes and seeing his need to physically force them out. But of course he couldn't do that, so he instead canceled class early. Shortly after that, our teacher had a complete mental breakdown and had to take a month or two of sick leave in order to get back to his normal self, solely because of this one little crap and her cohort. I know the ringleader must have had some problems in her life because behavior like this doesn't just happen. I don't remember what became of her, but I know her friend eventually changed and became a really nice person. Story 23. 11th grade French class. Our school had been slowly and methodically altering the school dress code over the past year, as girls were wearing revealing clothing that was distracting to other students. We're talking about spaghetti strap tank tops, short shorts, and short skirts. This was the early 2000s, so there were rumblings among the student body about how this was unfair and sexist. For the most part, the dress code was barely enforced, as even the administrators knew that sitting in a classroom without air conditioning during a 95-degree heat wave made wearing tank tops understandable, despite burgeoning bodies developing beneath such a tiny layer of fabric. My 11th grade French teacher disagreed. Every single girl who walked into her classroom with shoulders bare was sent to the principal's office. Every single one. After 3 to 4 days straight with a handful of girls being sent out of her room each period, a small but defiant group planned on seeking revenge. There was a 12th grade football player who, in addition to being a total freaking dreamboat, was a really funny guy. He walked into my French class that day wearing a very tight spaghetti strap tank top and miniskirt. He announced, "Mrs. French teacher, I have a question," swaying his hips back and forth. She went bright red and began screaming at the top of her lungs for him to leave her classroom, all while waving a spiral notebook in front of her as if to shoo him away. We were all in shock, trying not to laugh. Once he was out of the room with the door locked, she then sat back down at her desk and cried. She hated tank tops. This is absolutely a perfect example of allyship and activism, isn't it? Like, this guy wasn't really affected by the change, or at least the enforcement of these rules, right? But he sees it and he's like, well, this is really stupid and it's making a lot of, I assume, his friends unhappy. And he's like, I know it'll show how ridiculous this rule is, and then does this. Honestly, love that for him. This guy is a true Chad, not like the jerk Chad we talked about a few stories ago. This is a king incarnate. Story 24. In high school, my sophomore year math teacher had a breakdown during class because of the students. She was a kind woman in her early 40s and was not conventionally pretty. Students disrespected her constantly, whether it be complaining about homework or what group they were put in. One day she just started snapping back and started crying, and the other kids just laughed at her. The next year I became her teacher's aide and helped her grade papers and such during that period. Despite how students treated her then and still, she was one of the nicest teachers I'd ever had. Just a very gentle spirit. Okay, OP, I kind of get what you were trying to say, but also, you did not mention that the students made fun of her appearance at all. You are the only one who said she was conventionally not attractive, which is just a weird thing to bring up when you don't bring it up in the actual, harassing of her. I feel like this one could have been worded better because it sounds like OP just took a shot at the teacher too. I know that's not what they meant, obviously, but OP, you gotta work on that. Unfortunately, that is also the last story we have. A weird one to end it on. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed these stories. There were some really heartfelt ones in here, some really awful kids in here, a good mix. If you have any stories of your own, which I'm sure you do, this is a pretty relatable topic, throw them in the comments. For now, though, I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.